Have you ever noticed how life quietly slips away in the spaces we forget to pay attention? We wake up, rush through our routines, check our phones, chase deadlines, and lie down exhausted at night, only to repeat it all the next day. In this endless cycle, one thing is always with us, quietly keeping us alive, yet almost always ignored: our breath. We breathe about 20,000 times every single day. 20,000 little miracles, and yet, for most of us, not a single one is remembered. It's as if life has given us a gift that we keep in our hands but never unwrap. Imagine this: a newborn baby takes its first breath, and everyone in the room celebrates. A final breath leaves the body of a loved one, and the whole world seems to stop. Between those two breaths lies the story of an entire life. And yet, while we chase success, recognition, comfort, or distraction, we miss the very thing that makes life possible. Breathing is so ordinary that we forget it's extraordinary. It doesn't demand our attention. It doesn't beg for praise. It simply flows in and out like the rhythm of the ocean. But hidden within this rhythm is a secret the Buddha himself pointed to. Awakening is not found in some distant future, but right here, in this very breath. The masters of Zen often call breathing a bell of mindfulness. Every inhale and every exhale is like a gentle bell, ringing softly, reminding us that we are alive. Yet most of us have grown deaf to that sound. We scroll, we plan, we worry, we escape. And in this escape, life passes unnoticed. Pause for just a moment. Take a slow, gentle breath. Feel the cool air filling your lungs. Notice how, without effort, the body knows what to do. That single breath connects you to this moment. And this moment is all there ever truly is. The miracle is not complicated. It doesn't require wealth, status, or even years of study. Awakening begins in the simple act of noticing what has always been here. When you breathe with awareness, you are not only alive, you are truly living. Think about it. How many times have you been in a beautiful place, watching the sunset, walking under the stars, or sitting with someone you love, and yet your mind was elsewhere? You were there, but not really. You were breathing, but not alive to the breath. Awakening is the return, the gentle turning back to what is real, to what is now. There's a Zen saying, "The miracle is not walking on water. The miracle is walking on earth." And what makes that miracle possible is each breath that carries you forward, step by step, moment by moment. This is the forgotten miracle, that life itself is happening right under our noses, and most of us are too distracted to notice. But the good news is this: the path to awakening is not a distant mountain. It is not reserved for saints, monks, or mystics. It begins here, in the simplest act of remembering to breathe. Each breath is an invitation to return home to yourself, to set down the burdens of yesterday and the worries of tomorrow, to see clearly, feel deeply, and live fully. When you awaken to the breath, you awaken to life. And so, as we continue, let us look deeper into what awakening truly means. Because once we understand this, every breath will no longer be ordinary, it will be a doorway to freedom. When we hear the word awakening, it often feels mysterious, almost unreachable. We imagine enlightened beings sitting under ancient trees, their faces glowing with serenity, untouched by the struggles of ordinary life. For many, awakening sounds like some distant peak, reserved only for saints, monks, or philosophers who abandon the world. But what if awakening isn't about escaping life at all? What if it's about finally stepping into it? At its heart, awakening is simply seeing things as they are. It is clarity, it is presence, it is freedom from the restless patterns that keep us trapped in our own minds. Imagine for a moment a foggy window. You can see the outlines of the world, but everything is blurred, uncertain. Then someone wipes the glass, and suddenly the colors sharpen, the shapes become real. That moment of clarity, that is awakening. Most of us live in the fog. We breathe without noticing. We walk without truly feeling the ground beneath our feet. We speak without hearing ourselves, and we listen without really being present. We plan tomorrow while eating today's meal. We replay yesterday while ignoring the beauty right in front of us. Awakening is the simple, yet profound, act of wiping away that fog. The Buddha once described the human condition as sleepwalking. We are alive, but not fully awake to life. Awakening, then, is not adding something new to ourselves. It's not becoming superhuman. It's waking up from the dream we've been lost in. Think about a time you were completely present, maybe watching a child laugh, maybe standing before a vast ocean, maybe holding someone's hand and feeling time dissolve. In those rare moments, you weren't chasing, comparing, or worrying. You were awake. Awakening is not foreign to us. We already taste it in flashes. The journey is learning how to live there more often, to make each breath part of that awakened life. There's another image often used in Zen. Imagine being in a dark room for hours. Suddenly, someone lights a candle. The room hasn't changed, the walls, the furniture, the air are all the same. What changed is your ability to see. Awakening doesn't give you a new life. It allows you to finally see the life you've already been given. And here's the most important truth. Awakening is not a destination. It's not a golden medal you win after decades of meditation. It's not locked away in a monastery. Awakening is a practice, a returning, a remembering. Every conscious breath is a step into awakening. Every moment of awareness is a spark of clarity. This means awakening is not about being perfect. It's not about never feeling anger, never getting stressed, never making mistakes. Those experiences are part of life. Awakening means that even when anger arises, you notice it instead of becoming it. When stress tightens your chest, you take a breath instead of drowning in it. When mistakes happen, you learn instead of hiding. To be awake is to live with open eyes, open heart, and open breath. In Buddhism, awakening is sometimes described as seeing reality as it truly is. Reality is simple, yet our minds make it complicated. We cling to what we like, push away what we don't, and chase after what we think will complete us. But the truth is, life has always been complete, right here in this breath. Awakening is the moment you stop running and realize you've already arrived. So let's pause again. Take a breath. Notice how your body rises and falls. That's not just air entering your lungs, that is life gifting itself to you. Awakening is remembering this gift. And as we breathe with this awareness, a question naturally rises. If the breath can bring us back to life, then why is it chosen as the gateway to awakening in Buddhist practice? What makes it so powerful, so universal, that every tradition returns to it? Let's explore. Why is the breath so central to awakening? Why did the Buddha himself place it at the very heart of his teachings? Because the breath is always here. It doesn't matter who you are, where you were born, what language you speak, or what beliefs you hold. If you are alive, you breathe. The breath is universal. It doesn't belong to one religion, one culture, or one tradition. It is the bridge that quietly unites us all. But there's something even deeper. The breath is not only constant, it is also immediate. You can only breathe in this moment. You cannot inhale yesterday, and you cannot exhale tomorrow. The breath exists only now, and that makes it the perfect doorway to the present moment. When the Buddha taught anapanasati, the practice of mindfulness of breathing, he wasn't giving us a complicated ritual. He was pointing us to something so simple, so direct, that we often overlook it. He said, when you breathe in, know that you are breathing in. When you breathe out, know that you are breathing out. That's it. No philosophy, no theory, just awareness of what is already happening. It sounds almost too simple. But simplicity is where the power lies. Think about the last time your mind was scattered, maybe replaying an argument, worrying about a deadline, or feeling restless for no reason. Then, suddenly, you take a deep breath. Something shifts. Your shoulders soften. Your mind clears, even if just for a moment. The breath is like an anchor. When the storms of thought and emotion pull us away, the breath brings us back home. There's a story in Zen of a student who asked his master, "How can I find peace? How can I awaken?" The master replied, "When you breathe in, just breathe in. When you breathe out, just breathe out." The student, frustrated, said, "That's too easy." And the master smiled, "Then do it." The truth is, what is simple is not always easy. Our minds want complexity, but awakening asks for presence. Breath is also a teacher of impermanence. Notice how every inhale arises, stays for a moment, and then dissolves into an exhale. Each exhale vanishes, making space for the next inhale. Breath after breath, we are reminded that nothing in life can be held onto, not even the air that keeps us alive. In learning to let go of each breath, we learn to let go in life. And breath is a teacher of non-self. You may think, this is my breath. But where does it come from? The air you breathe is given by trees, by oceans, by the entire planet. Each breath connects you to the vast web of life. You are not separate. You are part of an infinite flow. Breathing with awareness is like remembering that we belong, that we are never truly alone. The beauty of the breath is that it's available anywhere. You don't need a quiet retreat center. You don't need hours of meditation. You can come back to your breath while standing in line at the grocery store, while sitting in traffic, while washing the dishes. In those simple moments, the ordinary becomes sacred. Try this. The next time you feel overwhelmed, stop. Close your eyes if you can. Inhale slowly. Notice the coolness of the air. Exhale gently. Feel the release. Do this 3 times, just 3 mindful breaths, and see how the world shifts. Problems may not vanish, but your relationship with them will. That is the power of the breath. It changes not the world outside, but the way you meet it. For centuries, masters across traditions have returned to the breath as the doorway to awakening. Because while thoughts belong to the past or the future, breath belongs only to now, and to awaken is to live in the now. So the breath is not just biology. It is not just oxygen in, carbon dioxide out. It is the rhythm of life itself, whispering, "Wake up, you are alive, be here." And yet, despite this miracle always being with us, most of us continue to forget it. Which leads us to an important question. If the breath is always available, why do we so often overlook it? What pulls us away from this simple gateway to life? If the breath is always here, always offering a doorway to the present, then why do we so often miss it? Why do we live as though life is a rehearsal rather than the main performance? The answer lies in distraction. Life today is unlike any time before in history. Our minds are constantly pulled in every direction: emails, notifications, news, social media, work, bills, obligations. We are always planning the future, replaying the past, or comparing ourselves to someone else. In this chaos, the simple miracle of a single conscious breath fades into the background. We forget to live fully because our attention is hijacked by what we think we need, by endless to-do lists, by the illusion that happiness lies somewhere out there. We chase achievements, possessions, and recognition, believing that fulfillment is a distant goal. And in doing so, we overlook the profound richness of this very moment. Even when we try to slow down, the mind has its own habits. It worries, regrets, analyzes, and judges. Our thoughts often operate like a constant river, carrying us away from the present. You might sit quietly, attempting to meditate, and suddenly realize you've been planning dinner or replaying a conversation from yesterday. This is human. This is normal. And yet, it is also the reason so many of us feel disconnected from life. Think of it this way. Imagine walking through a forest while staring at a phone screen. The trees, the sunlight, the birdsong, they are all around you, but you barely notice. Life, like the forest, is here, waiting for your attention, and your breath is the bridge back. We also forget to live because of our attachment to outcomes. We believe life only matters if it goes according to plan. But life rarely unfolds perfectly. Opportunities are missed, people leave, things break, and when we cling too tightly, we lose the very moment we are trying to protect. Awakening, in contrast, asks us to release that need for control, even if only for the duration of one mindful breath. Another reason we overlook life is the belief that awakening is something far away. We imagine enlightenment as a shining light atop a distant mountain. If we buy into this idea, we spend our lives waiting, always postponing joy, always chasing something beyond reach. But the truth is that every breath, every heartbeat, every sensory experience is already a doorway to awakening. The mountain is not ahead, it is here, beneath your feet, in your lungs, in your awareness. Even modern culture reinforces this disconnection. We are rewarded for productivity, multitasking, and speed, not for presence. We are taught to value doing over being. And so, we train ourselves to ignore the simple, extraordinary miracle that is happening every second of our lives. But there is hope. Because if we can see why we forget, we can also see how to remember. Awareness is like a muscle. The more we practice, the stronger it becomes. Every pause, every conscious breath, every moment we choose to fully inhabit our experience brings us back from the fog of distraction. Here's an invitation. Notice your breath right now. Not as a task, not as a goal, not as a meditation practice with a timer. Just notice it. Feel the coolness of air entering your nostrils, the gentle rise of your chest, the release as it leaves your body. Even this simple act, repeated often, begins to untangle the knots of distraction. We forget to live fully because life pulls us outward, but awakening calls us inward. It reminds us that the only place life truly happens is here now. And the only way to access it is through the doorway we've been ignoring all along, our breath. Once we understand this, it becomes clear why so many traditions, so many teachers, Insist on returning to the breath again and again. It is the anchor in the storm, the compass when we are lost, the key to living fully. And so, if distraction pulls us away, the breath pulls us back. If worry clouds our minds, the breath clears the fog. If attachment blinds us, the breath opens the eyes. All of this is simple. All of this is free. All of this is waiting always in each moment. The next step is to explore how awakening through mindful breathing works in practice. How this simple act can transform not just a single moment, but the way we navigate life entirely. Breathing, it seems so ordinary, so automatic. Yet within this simple rhythm lies the doorway to a profound awakening, a way to step out of distraction and truly inhabit your life. Mindful breathing is more than a technique. It is a return. A return to the present moment, to the body, to the heartbeat of existence. Every inhale invites you to receive life. Every exhale teaches you to release, to let go, to trust the flow of being. The practice is beautifully simple. Breathe in, knowing you are breathing in. Breathe out, knowing you are breathing out. That's it. No agendas, no expectations, just awareness. And within that awareness, everything shifts. Imagine a storm raging inside your mind, worries about the future, regrets from the past, tension in your body. One conscious breath acts like a lighthouse. The waves may still crash, but suddenly there is a point of clarity, a center of calm. One breath opens a space where thought does not dominate, where presence can shine. Zen masters often tell stories of students awakening through a single breath. One disciple would sit for hours, struggling with thoughts and restlessness. The master simply said, "Breathe, be here now." In that breath, the student glimpsed clarity beyond words, a taste of the life that had always been waiting, right beneath the surface of distraction. The beauty of mindful breathing is its accessibility. You do not need a temple, a cushion, or a retreat. You do not need special clothes or sacred chants. Every time you remember to inhale fully and exhale completely, you step into awakening. Washing dishes, walking to the store, sitting at your desk, all can become a meditation, a practice of returning. Breath is also transformative because it aligns the body and mind. When the mind races, the body tenses. When the body is tense, the mind races. Conscious breathing is a bridge between the two. By following the breath, by gently observing it, you restore balance, you restore presence, you restore clarity. Consider this simple exercise. Take 3 deep, conscious breaths. As you inhale, feel the air filling your lungs. As you exhale, notice the tension melting, the mind softening. Even this brief moment is a step toward awakening. It reminds you that life is happening now, not in a memory or a plan. Breathing mindfully also cultivates compassion. When you notice your own suffering, your own tension, your own distraction, you become aware of the human condition. This awareness naturally expands outward. Just as you recognize your breath, you begin to recognize the breath, the life, the struggles of others. Awareness and compassion grow together. Thich Nh letter 1EA5T, H letter 1EA1NH often emphasizes that mindful breathing is a practice of returning home. Home to your body, home to your mind, home to the present. Each inhale is a welcome, each exhale is a release. The miracle is that awakening is not somewhere else. It is right here in the rhythm of your own life. And here is the most astonishing part. You don't have to change your life to awaken. You don't need to quit your job, move to a monastery, or renounce the world. You awaken by noticing the ordinary, by returning to the breath in the midst of the ordinary. Cooking, commuting, typing emails, talking to friends, all of it becomes fertile ground for awakening when your breath is your guide. So, pause for a moment now. Feel your lungs expand. Feel your chest rise. Feel your shoulders soften. Feel the air as it leaves your body. This is the simplest form of meditation. This is the purest form of awakening. This is a doorway that has always been open, waiting for you to notice. And as you settle into this awareness, something extraordinary happens. You realize that each breath is not just life, it is freedom. Freedom from distraction, freedom from clinging, freedom from the illusion that fulfillment lies somewhere beyond this moment. The breath teaches patience, clarity, and presence. It teaches impermanence, showing how every inhale arises and falls away, just like every thought, every emotion, every moment. And it teaches gratitude, for the air, for the body, for life itself. By practicing mindful breathing, awakening is no longer an abstract idea or a distant goal. It becomes tangible, immediate, intimate. Each breath is an opportunity to return to life, to step fully into the present, to live without apology, without pretense, without distraction. And as you deepen this awareness, the next natural question arises. What does science say about this practice? Why does something so simple have such profound effects on our mind, body, and emotions? Let's explore how the science of breath validates what Buddhist masters have known for centuries. Breathing, it seems so ordinary, so automatic. Yet within this simple rhythm lies the doorway to a profound awakening, a way to step out of distraction and truly inhabit your life. Mindful breathing is more than a technique. It is a return. A return to the present moment, to the body, to the heartbeat of existence. Every inhale invites you to receive life. Every exhale teaches you to release, to let go, to trust the flow of being. The practice is beautifully simple. Breathe in, knowing you are breathing in. Breathe out, knowing you are breathing out. That's it. No agendas, no expectations, just awareness. And within that awareness, everything shifts. Imagine a storm raging inside your mind, worries about the future, regrets from the past, tension in your body. One conscious breath acts like a lighthouse. The waves may still crash, but suddenly there is a point of clarity, a center of calm. One breath opens a space where thought does not dominate, where presence can shine. Zen masters often tell stories of students awakening through a single breath. One disciple would sit for hours, struggling with thoughts and restlessness. The master simply said, "Breathe, be here now." In that breath, the student glimpsed clarity beyond words, a taste of the life that had always been waiting, right beneath the surface of distraction. The beauty of mindful breathing is its accessibility. You do not need a temple, a cushion, or a retreat. You do not need special clothes or sacred chants. Every time you remember to inhale fully and exhale completely, you step into awakening. Washing dishes, walking to the store, sitting at your desk, all can become a meditation, a practice of returning. Breath is also transformative because it aligns the body and mind. When the mind races, the body tenses. When the body is tense, the mind races. Conscious breathing is a bridge between the two. By following the breath, by gently observing it, you restore balance, you restore presence, you restore clarity. Consider this simple exercise. Take 3 deep, conscious breaths. As you inhale, feel the air filling your lungs. As you exhale, notice the tension melting, the mind softening. Even this brief moment is a step toward awakening. It reminds you that life is happening now, not in a memory or a plan. Breathing mindfully also cultivates compassion. When you notice your own suffering, your own tension, your own distraction, you become aware of the human condition. This awareness naturally expands outward. Just as you recognize your breath, you begin to recognize the breath, the life, the struggles of others. Awareness and compassion grow together. Thich nh letter 1ea5t, h letter 1ea1nh often emphasizes that mindful breathing is a practice of returning home. Home to your body, home to your mind, home to the present. Each inhale is a welcome, each exhale is a release. The miracle is that awakening is not somewhere else. It is right here in the rhythm of your own life. And here is the most astonishing part. You don't have to change your life to awaken. You don't need to quit your job, move to a monastery, or renounce the world. You awaken by noticing the ordinary, by returning to the breath in the midst of the ordinary. Cooking, commuting, typing emails, talking to friends, all of it becomes fertile ground for awakening when your breath is your guide. So, pause for a moment now. Feel your lungs expand. Feel your chest rise. Feel your shoulders soften. Feel the air as it leaves your body. This is the simplest form of meditation. This is the purest form of awakening. This is a doorway that has always been open, waiting for you to notice. And as you settle into this awareness, something extraordinary happens. You realize that each breath is not just life, it is freedom. Freedom from distraction, freedom from clinging, freedom from the illusion that fulfillment lies somewhere beyond this moment. The breath teaches patience, clarity, and presence. It teaches impermanence, showing how every inhale arises and falls away, just like every thought, every emotion, every moment. And it teaches gratitude, for the air, for the body, for life itself. By practicing mindful breathing, awakening is no longer an abstract idea or a distant goal. It becomes tangible, immediate, intimate. Each breath is an opportunity to return to life, to step fully into the present, to live without apology, without pretense, without distraction. And as you deepen this awareness, the next natural question arises. What does science say about this practice? Why does something so simple have such profound effects on our mind, body, and emotions? Let's explore how the science of breath validates what Buddhist masters have known for centuries. For centuries, masters of mindfulness and meditation have pointed to the breath as a gateway to awakening. But modern science is beginning to catch up, revealing what our ancestors always knew. The breath is not just a biological function, it is a powerful tool for transforming the mind and body. Research shows that conscious breathing activates the parasympathetic nervous system, the part of our nervous system responsible for rest, recovery, and calm. In other words, one simple act, taking a deep, mindful breath, can signal to your body it's safe, you can relax, you can return to the present. Functional MRI studies reveal that mindful breathing changes brain activity. Areas associated with stress, worry, and negative thought patterns quiet down, while regions connected to attention, awareness, and emotional regulation become more active. Simply put, when we pay attention to our breath, we reshape the way our brain operates. We create clarity and calm where before there was distraction and chaos. Science also confirms something subtle but profound. Breath connects mind and body in real time. Heart rate, blood pressure, and even hormone levels respond to conscious breathing. Slow, deep inhalations, followed by gentle exhalations, reduce cortisol, the stress hormone, and improve heart rate variability, a marker of resilience and emotional balance. Every breath becomes a small act of healing, a recalibration of body and mind. And yet, the implications go even deeper. Studies show that mindful breathing improves attention and cognitive performance. People who practice a few minutes of breath awareness daily report better focus, improved memory, and greater creativity. The breath doesn't just calm the mind, it sharpens it. Psychologists explain this effect through what they call interoception, the ability to sense what is happening inside the body. By paying attention to the rise and fall of the chest, the expansion of the lungs, the flow of air, we reconnect with the body's signals. We notice tension, stress, or emotional unrest before it overwhelms us. Awareness becomes the bridge to wisdom. Even in clinical settings, breath-based practices are gaining recognition. Hospitals, therapy centers, and schools use mindful breathing to reduce anxiety, treat insomnia, and manage chronic pain. Patients learn that they have a tool that is always available, free, and effective: their own breath. This scientific evidence is remarkable because it validates what Buddhism has emphasized for thousands of years. The breath is a bridge between life and awareness, between body and mind, between ordinary living and awakening. It is both natural and extraordinary, simple and profound. But science alone cannot capture the full depth of the breath. It can measure heart rate, brain waves, and hormone levels, but it cannot measure the feeling of peace that comes when you take a single conscious breath after a day of chaos. It cannot quantify the sense of homecoming when you remember that each inhale and exhale is a doorway back to life. This is where science and wisdom meet. Science explains how the breath transforms us physically and mentally. Buddhist philosophy reveals why the breath is sacred. It is life itself, moment by moment, always present, always available, always miraculous. Take a moment now, close your eyes if you can. Inhale deeply, noticing the coolness of the air, the expansion of your chest. Exhale slowly, letting go of tension, allowing your mind to soften. Feel your heartbeat, feel your body grounded. This is the union of science and practice. This is awareness in motion. The science confirms what we have already discovered through experience. Every breath has the power to transform. Every moment of mindful inhalation and exhalation is a step toward clarity, peace, and freedom. Each breath is a reminder that awakening is not a theory, not a distant goal, not a spiritual luxury. It is accessible here and now. And as the research continues to unfold, one message becomes increasingly clear. The path to living fully, to awakening, and to true presence is always available in this simple, miraculous rhythm. Every inhale, every exhale is a lesson, a tool, and a doorway. So if the science of the breath shows us the mechanisms, the next question naturally arises: What does life itself look like when we embrace this practice fully? How do ordinary people transform their daily lives by awakening through mindful breathing? Let's hear their stories. We've seen how the breath can anchor us, calm our minds, and bring presence to our daily lives. But in Buddhism, the breath carries a deeper meaning, a wisdom that goes far beyond relaxation or focus. It is a teacher of life itself. The first lesson the breath offers is impermanence, anicca. Every inhale arises and falls away. Every exhale dissolves into the next. Nothing remains fixed, nothing lasts forever, not even the air moving through your lungs. Each breath is a fleeting moment, a reminder that life is always changing. In this understanding, we begin to let go of clinging, the grasping at comfort, the desire to control outcomes, the attachment to what we think we need. Then there is the teaching of non-self, anatta. When you breathe, you may think, "This is my breath." But in truth, it is not owned. The air you inhale comes from the world around you, the trees, the oceans, the atmosphere. Your breath connects you to the vast web of life, showing that you are not separate. You are part of an endless cycle of giving and receiving, of life supporting life. Awareness of this interconnection softens the ego, reminding us that we are not isolated individuals, but participants in a larger, living tapestry. The breath also illuminates the principle of interdependence, pratityasamutpada. Each moment arises in dependence on countless factors: the air, the heart, the mind, the environment, the countless causes and conditions that make this breath possible. The simplicity of the breath reveals the complexity of existence, showing that nothing exists in isolation. This awareness cultivates humility, compassion, and gratitude. Consider the monks of old, sitting in silent meditation, focusing entirely on the rise and fall of the abdomen. They were not merely counting breaths, they were observing the rhythm of life, the impermanence of all things, and the interconnectedness of self and world. Each breath became a window into the truth of existence. Mindful breathing also teaches us acceptance. Life is not always comfortable. Breath is sometimes shallow, rapid, or irregular. Emotions rise and fall. Thoughts crowd the mind, but by observing the breath without judgment, we learn to accept what is. We do not chase perfection. We return again and again, with patience, to the rhythm of our own life. There is a story of a Zen master who instructed a student, "Feel your breath as it is, not as you wish it to be. Let each breath teach you the truth of the present moment." In that instruction lies the essence of awakening. Reality is already perfect in its imperfection, and our awareness of it brings freedom. The breath also embodies the cycle of life and death. From the first inhale of a newborn to the last exhale of a dying person, breath is the thread that connects us to existence. Each inhalation brings life, each exhalation returns it. Recognizing this cycle allows us to live fully, to appreciate the fragile beauty of every moment, and to face mortality with grace. Through mindful breathing, we begin to see life as it truly is, fleeting, interconnected, and sacred. Every inhale and exhale is a lesson in wisdom, a meditation in motion, a chance to awaken. The ordinary act of breathing becomes extraordinary, revealing truths that words cannot capture. Awakening through the breath is not a distant goal. It is not a destination to reach after years of meditation or perfect practice. It is a living, breathing reality that is always available, here now, in this very moment. To live fully, one breath at a time, is to embrace life as it unfolds, without clinging or resisting. Each inhale is an opportunity to receive what is. Each exhale is an invitation to release what no longer serves us. Life becomes a dance with the present, and the breath is our partner, guiding us step by step. Consider the ordinary moments of a day. Waking in the morning, rushing through a shower, brushing teeth, pouring coffee, these moments often pass unnoticed. But when we bring awareness to the breath, even the mundane transforms. The aroma of coffee, the warmth of water, the sunlight through the window, all become vivid, alive, and full of meaning. Breathing consciously turns ordinary life into a meditation, a celebration of presence. Living fully also means embracing discomfort. Life is not always smooth. Stress, pain, frustration, and uncertainty are inevitable, but the breath is our anchor. When tension rises, noticing the inhale and exhale grounds us. When emotions swirl, following the rhythm of the lungs restores clarity. Mindful breathing teaches that even in challenge, we can be awake, centered, and alive. There's power in consistency, even in small acts. 1 breath, 2 breaths, 3, these add up. A single conscious breath may seem insignificant, but over time, each awareness strengthens the mind, reshapes habits, and deepens presence. The key is not perfection. The key is returning again and again to the moment, to the breath, to life itself. Awakening is not about escaping the world. It is about engaging with it fully, with clarity and compassion. When we breathe consciously, we listen more deeply, respond more wisely, and act with intention. The breath connects us to our bodies, our minds, and the people around us. It transforms relationships because presence is contagious. When we are awake, others feel it. When we are mindful, the world responds. Even the simplest acts become profound. Walking to the store, we notice each step. Washing dishes, we feel the water, the motion, the rhythm. Eating, we savor the taste, the texture, the life nourishing us. Breathing consciously turns the ordinary into sacred practice. Each moment is alive, each moment is complete, each breath is a doorway to presence. And here's the most subtle lesson. Life does not always wait for us to be ready. Time moves, moments pass, and the only thing we truly possess is the now. The breath is the reminder that life is continuous, and each moment is an invitation to wake up. By following it, we learn to live fully, not in anticipation or regret, but in awareness and gratitude. Living fully also deepens our compassion. Awareness of our own breath opens our awareness to the struggles, joys, and presence of others. We begin to see that everyone is breathing, everyone is living, everyone is seeking happiness and avoiding suffering. The simple act of noticing our own breath becomes a bridge to understanding and empathy, connecting us to the world in profound ways. The practice is gentle, yet revolutionary. It does not force transformation, it allows it to unfold naturally. 1 breath at a time, the mind softens, the heart opens, and life becomes alive. Ordinary moments become extraordinary, ordinary people become awake, and the miracle of existence reveals itself in the rhythm of the lungs. As we continue this journey, 1 breath at a time, we are reminded that awakening is not a conclusion. It is an ongoing process. Each inhale is a new beginning. Each exhale is a chance to let go. And with every conscious breath, we step more fully into the life that has always been here, waiting, breathing with us, ready to be lived. As we reach the end of this journey, take a moment to return to your breath. Notice it, feel it, honor it. Every inhale is a gift, every exhale a release. This is not just meditation, this is life, unfolding in its purest, simplest form. Awakening is not a distant summit to climb, nor a prize to earn. It is not hidden in some secret place, waiting for the worthy. Awakening has always been here, in the rhythm of your lungs, in the pulse of your heart, in the gentle unfolding of each present moment. Every breath you take is an opportunity to return home, to yourself, to life, and to the world around you. The practice does not end with this video. It lives in your day-to-day, in the ordinary and the extraordinary. In moments of joy, in moments of challenge, in moments of silence, in moments of noise. The breath is your doorway to awareness, your anchor to presence, your teacher in the art of living fully. So as you go forth today, remember this: the miracle is not somewhere else. The miracle is here, right now, in this breath. And if this message resonated with you, if you feel the quiet power of presence stirring within, I invite you to continue walking this path with us. Subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom, where each week we explore teachings, stories, and practices to awaken your mind, nurture your heart, and live fully in each moment. Take a deep breath and know that awakening is always with you.